So the first time I ever met Tessa Jowell was at a big gathering, and she struck me as an incredibly impressive individual. I know Richard's met her and several of others. But at the end of the day, she was a patient with a glioblastoma. She was a patient with a brain cancer. She happened to be someone who had a seat in the House of Lords and who gave a seminal speech. And I would suggest to you that that is on behalf of everybody with a brain tumour and all the families connected with her. She was a remarkable woman, and I only knew her very briefly. But one of the things that I've had to do is I had to stand up and give talks a couple of times. The first time I stood up, I hadn't prepared a speech. I was going to wing it. And the first guy got up and he prepared he's got his paper out and gave a talk. And the one after that followed. And then I came up and I thought, I've no prepared speech. And I winged it, a bit like Richard's just done. So the second time I had to stand up and give a talk about Brainmatrix, I thought, right, I'm going to have a speech prepared. So I wrote it all down. I did it on the train. And I folded it up into a nice thing that went in my pocket. And I wrote down exactly what I was going to do. And I stood up at the lectern. You remember this, Richard, at the House of Lords. And with the glasses I had on, I couldn't see what I'd written. So this time, big letters. What is Brainmatrix? Brainmatrix is a lot of things, really. For the purposes of this talk, I want to suggest to you that Brainmatrix is a vision. And I want to share that with you. For the scientists among you, it's a platform trial that is designed to deliver stratified medicine for patients with brain cancer. I suspect to a lot of you that doesn't mean a lot. I'm a surgeon, it doesn't mean a lot to me. But what is the vision? The vision essentially is developed around key principles. The first one I want to mention is access. We want to get as many patients into clinical trials. And for a long time, I was chair of the NCRI Brain Clinical Subgroup, which manages the UK trial portfolio. And during my tenure, I had the very modest success of increasing the number of patients who went into clinical trials from 4% to 5%. The reality is that the more specific the question, the smaller the population that are eligible to be recruited. So if you want to increase access, we wanted a simple study. We wanted something that was so basic, we could recruit lots of patients to it. And we had a long discussion. The Brainmatrix is not the product of a single individual. My role has just been to try and corral people and to occasionally give them a bollocking for not finishing things on time. So what we did is we came up with this idea that we would look at extent of resection, and for surgeons this is a recurring theme. And there is a lot of data out there, but almost all of it is retrospective. So what we did is we said, well, we'll do a prospective observational study. And we'll ask the simple question, does extent of resection really matter? And in order to capture the whole spectrum of what happens to patients, we made the inclusion criteria very easy. Basically, if you are eligible for surgery, if you're fit enough to have either a biopsy or a craniotomy, then you're eligible to go into the clinical trial. In order to deliver that, we had to build an infrastructure. And to do that, what we did is we pulled together a network of 10 centres. How did we include the centres? Well, we mapped them onto the UK Experimental Cancer Medicine Centre network, which gives you a benchmark of quality. And we hooked those 10 centres as a clinical hub with the NIHR Biorepository, which is a state-of-the-art facility for the collection and storage of biological samples, tumours, blood, CSF and the like. And we also set up an imaging hub, so we've got a repository for all the imaging data. And as surgeons, what we can do now with the technologies that we have in the advanced centres is we can take individual samples spatially distributed through tumours, and we can provide radiological annotation of where those samples have been taken. So if we combine that with the clinical data, we have a fantastic collection of data that is associated with our biological understanding of the disease. And the idea is that we aggregate all that data, we feed it back to the clinical hubs to inform clinical care of patients, and we put it into something called BRAIN, which is a data repository the Brain Tumour Charity have been working on. And that data in BRAIN, we hope, will become a resource for researchers all over the world who can start to understand how the disease of brain cancer varies between different tumours and different types. Because a critical factor with Brainmatrix is that it is age agnostic, it is geographically agnostic, and it is agnostic to the different types of tumours, all gliomas, adults, children, everybody. So the idea is that we pull all that together and we use that. And we've also got funding to look at the genetics, building on the infrastructure left behind by the 100,000K genome project from Genome England. What that will do is it will allow us to look at the genetics of about 1,500 patients. Using that information, we then want to try to get better targeting of drugs to patients. But we also want to raise the bar because a lot of patients have gone into trials and the trials have failed. The trials have used drugs that have been tested properly, they've been developed properly. And one of the tragedies of a lot of these trials is that we don't know why they failed. We haven't learned from failure. And a key philosophy for what we do with the Brain Tumour Charity in Brainmatrix is we want to learn from failure. Because make no mistake about it, we're not going to get it right first time. So one of the first things that we wanted to do from my discussions with a lot of investigators around the world, when we ask a question, okay, this drug didn't work on the patients you tried it in, what's your evidence that the drug gets into the tumour in the patients? And you'd be astounded at the number of times there's a shrug, or if they're honest, we don't know if the drug gets into the patients. So what was your criteria for investing millions of pounds in developing those trials? Oh, well, it got into the tumours in our mice. As a businessman, you wouldn't make an investment based on those criteria. So what we want to do is we want to up the game. And we've been working with drug companies, AstraZeneca is a good example, to say, look, if we can engage with you early in the development of your drugs, as you're thinking of taking something into the clinical arena, what we can do is we can provide the infrastructure so that once you know what dose you want to use in patients, we can test if at that dose the drug gets into the tumour, because we can arrange it so that we can give the drug, operate on the patient, take some tissue, and test that the drug gets into the tumour and that it does what it's supposed to do. It does what it says on the tin. By doing that, we de-risk investment and we engage with pharma, with industry, with the commercial sector as equal partners. And I would argue we can go further. Because one of the things that happens in clinical trials, if you start to look at clinical trials and then the science that Richard's been alluding to, one of the problems is that the science is often bolted on to the clinical trial. We have a clinical trial, we're looking for a specific response, I don't know, something like tumour shrinkage or changes in blood vessels, and so we do a bit of science pegged onto that. What about if we flipped it and we said, okay, going forward in the future, what if we did a clinical trial where the primary outcome of that clinical trial was not to test whether a drug worked or not, but was to answer a scientific question? Was to say, for example, a trial to understand how the immune landscape of a brain tumour changes in time as a result of standard of care. And then as the science rolls out and we get the results, and Richard and his team publish fantastic papers in Nature and Cell and all the rest of it, we can use that information to say, actually, let's bolt on the drug because the science tells us that this is the drug that we should be bolting on. So we flip that. It's about doing things differently. It's about thinking differently. And that's one of the things that we're doing within Brainmatrix. It's a challenge that's out there. Second one is about data. The zeitgeist in the world at the moment is about big data. We all want to collect as much data as possible. If you're a trialist, you want to collect the minimum amount of data necessary to answer the question. So you've got this tension between what a trial coordinator would like to collect and what big data would like us to collect. But it gets even better because in the reality within the NHS, which I agree with Richard, is a fantastic resource that we don't really appreciate. We can't share data between hospitals, even within a region, in such a way that it would inform treatment of patients because the data has to be completely anonymized. So within Brainmatrix, one of the things that we're doing is we're hooking up with the existing UK data infrastructure through the MRC-funded HDR networks to begin the process of trying to understand how we can share data between hospitals. So data is critical, and that's also an important part of the treatment and trials program within the brain cancer mission. The other thing is drugs. We've talked about how we can get drugs and how we can de-risk investment. The other thing we want to do is understand and learn from the limitations of using the genetic data we can already get. And the reality is that when you start looking at genetic data from patients, even if you get a mutation that is hooked with a drug, getting access to that drug is hugely challenging, may not even be possible. And the other thing that we're beginning to learn is that it's not just good enough to know that there's a mutation. We need to know what that mutation does. We need to know if it's still relevant if we're going to give a drug. Otherwise, we could give a drug, and if that mutation is no longer relevant in the disease, it won't work. All of these things we need to take into consideration in developing new trials and strategies. But at the same time, Brainmatrix will go a step further because it will create that environment that is adaptive, that is learning. It will partner with the commercial sector to develop drugs. It will partner with the training and development program from the Brain Cancer Mission and beyond to train the next generation of medical oncologists. Last year, when I was stood up to give a talk, we were running late. And the first day I stood up to give a talk, and I stood, and the first thing I looked up and I saw was the Brain Tumour charity had put up a sign saying 3 minutes remaining. And they've just done that. But I'm nearly done. I am nearly done. I think the other thing that we want to do is we want to raise awareness. Tessa Jowell has a high political profile. Many of you have heard of the Brain Cancer Mission. Richard is doing fantastic work raising the profile of that. And Brainmatrix is all part of that. It's part of the raising the profile. It's part of telling the story. And it's part of investing in patients, getting everybody into clinical trials, getting everybody into studies, so that we can learn from everybody, learn from every patient, learn from every disease, every story that is happening. That's what Brainmatrix is. Thank you.